thank you so much for allowing us to be here today. I pray that you will clear our minds of any distractions and help us just focus on you during this time that we spend together. Help us summarize your word clearly and concisely, and help us gain a better big picture grasp of the text that we are discussing. We love you, God. We praise you. It's in your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so we are continuing our discussion, going just big picture through the whole story of the Bible, Genesis, Revelation. And where we finished off, 3 weeks ago now? Because we had 2 weeks off.
Right.
3 weeks ago now, we finished by talking about basically the conquest of Canaan under Joshua. That's weird. The conquest of Canaan under Joshua, the period of the judges after that, and then into the book of Ruth, which we talked about at the very end. Today, we are going to be focusing specifically on the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, and that's really what we're mainly going to be looking at. But if you're wanting some extra details about some of the stuff we're talking about today, you can also go to the book of 1st Chronicles and get a lot there as well. Because in the book of 1st Chronicles, you have a condensed, but also just a different account of the same things we're talking about today, right? And so what we're talking about is what I would call the rise of the kingdom, right? The rise of the monarchy in Israel. And then next week, Lord willing, we'll be talking about the collapse of the monarchy. And so really just big picture stuff. What we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about Samuel, the final judge. We're going to talk about Saul, the first king of Israel. And we're going to talk about David, the second king of Israel. And for those of y'all who are part of our Tuesday night group, you'll know what a challenge we have ahead of us, because we spent, almost 2 years probably covering the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Right? Today we are going to cover that in hopefully around 2 hours, right? And so we are condensing down what we spent months and months and months going through in depth, and we're just going to be talking about big picture stuff, right? And that's because that's the whole purpose of what we're doing here. I'm not wanting us to go super in depth here. I'm just trying to highlight key themes that will help you understand the story as a whole. And so maybe just to recap us, to get us where we're at right here, the people of Israel have been freed from bondage in Egypt. Right, they wandered around the wilderness for 40 years, and then eventually Moses died. And after that 40 years of punishment, God allowed a guy named Joshua to lead the people of Israel into the land of Canaan, which they conquered under Joshua. But that conquest is still going on, right? They conquered enough of it under Joshua for it to be known as the land of Israel. But that conquest is still an ongoing thing that isn't really going to be fulfilled until the time period of David, right? So David is going to kind of fulfill the conquest. He's going to usher in a time of peace, which will then be handed on to his son Solomon, who we will talk about next week. And so, really what we focused on a lot last time we met was the period of the judges, right? Because after Joshua dies, or shortly before Joshua dies, he asked the people who they were going to serve, right? He said, "Choose this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And everybody collectively agreed, we will serve Yahweh. If you remember, during their time in the wilderness, God gave them this special law. And basically, the rules of the law were, if you are faithful to the law and you are devoted to me, things will go well for you in the land. However, if you disobey the law and are not faithful to me, things will go poorly for you in the land. Right? And so the law was not about salvation. It was simply about how God was going to demonstrate his glory through the people of Israel before all the nations. And so the people said they were going to be faithful to God, but when you get to the period of the judges, they're not very faithful. And over the course of the book of Judges, things start falling apart more and more and more, so that you get to the end of the book. And in summary, the author says that in those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. And we know that God was supposed to be their king, right? Yahweh was their king. He's the lawgiver. But it seems like the author of Judges has come to a conclusion that maybe the people need a king. Right? Because the people don't seem to be very good at serving that which they cannot see. And so when we go into 1st and 2nd Samuel, we're going to see that transition. Right? We're going to go from the time period of the judges to the time period of the kings. And it all begins with this guy named Samuel, who's going to be our final judge. And the way that Samuel's story starts off is not actually with Samuel at all. It starts off with his mother named Hannah. At this time period, Samuel's not been born. But what you need to know is that Hannah is the second wife of a man. So this man has 2 wives. That's not really a good situation. But Hannah is the favored wife of the two wives. However, she is infertile, and she desperately wants to have a child. And so one day, whenever they are going to go worship before the Lord, Hannah, she goes and she begins to pray, right? And she falls on her face, and she's weeping and crying, and she's praying to God, but there are no words coming out of her mouth, right? It's a silent prayer, but her lips are like moving, right? And she's saying, God, I just want a child. Well, the high priest at this time period, his name is Eli, he comes across Hannah, and he sees her acting like this. He thinks it's kind of weird, and he actually rebukes her because he thinks that she's drunk, right? It kind of tells you a little bit about the time period of the judges, that you see somebody in the house of the Lord, and here they are praying, but you think it's more likely that they're just a drunk who stumbled in, right? Because it doesn't seem like there were a lot of pious people at this time period. And so Eli rebukes Hannah and says, hey, get out of here. We don't have any drunks over this area. This is a holy place. But Hannah explains her situation to him. And then Eli lets her, go on her way. And so she's praying to God, and she says she wants a child. And she explains to him that if God gives her a child, she'll give the child back to God, right? It's not even that, it's not like she's just praying for selfish reasons, right? She just wants a child just to be a mother, right? And she says, God, if you give me a child, I'll give him right back to you. He will grow up. He will be raised by Eli. He'll be raised up as a priest in your temple. It'll be amazing. And God looks upon Hannah with favor and gives her a child. And what you see in the early chapters of 1 Samuel is that Hannah breaks out into song, right? And this song is absolutely amazing. But there's one part of the song that I in particular want to highlight here. 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 10. Hannah, basically the whole song is just her praising God for being able to do unlikely things, right? That God can take a barren woman and give her a child and stuff like that. And what she says here is she says, those who contend with Yahweh will be dismayed. Against them he will thunder in the heavens. Yahweh will render justice to the ends of the earth, and he will give strength to his king, and he will exalt the horn of his anointed. There are really two things that are significant here. The first one is that you'll notice that the word king shows up. Well, that's interesting because Hannah says that God will give strength to his king, even though there is no king in Israel, right? We just read that in the book of Judges.
Right.
But Hannah is prophesying here that the time period is coming when there will be a king in Israel, which Moses also predicted back in Deuteronomy, right? He predicted that one day they would appoint a king over themselves and stuff like that. And so Hannah predicts this. But then there's also a word that she associates with the king that is going to be very, very significant to us going forward, not only for the rest of the Old Testament, but also into the New Testament, and even to us right here, right now, as we are sitting here gathered today. She says, he will give strength to his king, and he will exalt the horn of his anointed. Right? If you know the way that Hebrew poetry works, you'll know that whereas we write usually with rhymes, they write with parallel, it's called parallelism. Right? So usually the way that we convey poetry is that we rhyme words, whereas for them, they rhyme meanings, if that makes sense. So it's not necessarily the words themselves that rhyme, but it's two lines next to each other that are conveying some of the same thoughts. Right? And so those two lines, it says, he will give strength to his king, he will exalt the horn of his anointed one. Right? So both those two lines are saying the same thing, but she's using two different titles to refer to the king. The first one is the Hebrew word melech, which just means king. The second one is the Hebrew word Mashiach, which we translate as anointed because that's what Mashiach means. It means anointed one. What's significant about this is not that this is the first time that the word Mashiach shows up, because like I said, the word Mashiach just means anointed, right? It's been used plenty of times throughout the Old Testament so far. But this is the first time in Scripture where we have the word Mashiach specifically associated with the term king, right? And Mashiach is where we get what word? Messiah, right? So Mashiach, when you translate it to English, is Messiah. And whenever you eventually translate it over to Greek and stuff like that, it becomes the word Christos, which is where we get the name Christian, right? So Jesus is the Christ. He is the Messiah. We are followers of the Christ. We are followers of the Messiah, right? And so the main reason I want to highlight this is because here at the beginning of 1 Samuel, we have the word Messiah being associated with king for the first time. Typically, the word anointed was associated with three different offices, right? Prophets, priests, or kings, right? Because prophets were usually the ones who were anointed and who were anointed people. priests had to be anointed in order to become a priest, and then kings were also anointed by the prophets and the priests in order to become kings, right? So whenever you think of the anointed ones in Scripture, you're usually thinking of a prophet, a priest, or a king. Interestingly enough, for us as Christians, we would say that Jesus fulfilled all three of those roles, right? He is our prophet, priest, and king. He is truly the Messiah of Messiahs. But in particular here, we have Hannah's song where she says that God will strengthen the horn of his Messiah. And one thing that I have tried to kind of teach y'all as we've been going through this whole overview thing is that whenever the Bible is talking in narrative form, and then it suddenly breaks up the narrative and gives you a poem, what is the author usually trying to convey to us right there?
You mean like when they break the immersion? Is that what we're talking about?
Well, yeah. So, like, if you were to flip to 1 Samuel, you'll notice that all of chapter 1 is narrative, and then starting in chapter 2, verse 11. So immediately after these words right here, starting in chapter 2, verse 11, and moving onwards, it's narrative once again. So there's this random poem in the middle of all of it. And I've talked about this in the past. What is the author trying to convey to us whenever there's a poem in the middle of narrative?
I always thought that it was just done to separate ideas. Although that's just a very simplified guess, so I don't really know much about this.
Yeah. So usually what the author is doing there is he's actually giving us a lens through which to interpret the rest of the story.
Okay.
Right? Because think about it. Poetry is usually the stuff that sticks in our heads. Right? Whenever you leave church on Sundays, usually it's the songs you sang in church that are ringing in your heads more than the sermon. Right? And so, here you've got this poem in the middle of it, and that is going to be ringing in your head as you read the rest of the book. And so, what you'll notice is that 1 Samuel begins with a poem right here, and then the beginning of 2 Samuel has a poem, and at the end of 2 Samuel also has a poem. Right? So, at three key moments, the beginning, the middle, and the end of the whole story of Samuel, you've got poems to help you interpret the whole thing. And one big aspect that's going to help us understand what God is doing in 1 and 2 Samuel is understanding that God is divinely working in miraculous and powerful ways behind the scenes to strengthen his Messiah and to raise up his anointed one. Right? And so, if you keep that lens in mind, you'll be able to understand the story a little bit better. You keep reading through 1 Samuel chapter 2, and what you see is that Eli, the high priest, right? So once again, once Samuel is born, Hannah returns Samuel to Eli, and Eli is going to raise Samuel up. And we learn that Eli has sons of his own, but these are very, very corrupt sons. And yes, Eli does get onto them, but he doesn't really do a very good job at it, right? Eli, we kind of get the impression that he is, he's very righteous in his speech, but he doesn't really commit to that righteousness in his actions, right? To where he says a lot of spiritual things, but doesn't really back it up with genuine discipline. And so he gets on to his sons, but doesn't really do much to change that. And so we see that God is very, very upset with Eli and with Eli's entire household. And so if you're reading through this, you get to see that Samuel begins to grow up in the house of Eli, and he begins to be strengthened in all these things. And while he is growing up and he is becoming a man of God, Eli's sons are increasingly wicked. Then you get to chapter 3. And in 1 Samuel chapter 3, you have a very famous story where Samuel, now a young boy, he is, just sleeping at night, and God calls to him. Samuel, Samuel!
Oh, I remember this.
And Samuel says, yes? But he doesn't think it's God, so he goes and wakes Eli up and says, Eli, what do you want? And Eli says, Samuel, I didn't call for you. Go back to bed. Samuel says, okay. A little bit later, Samuel, Samuel! Samuel gets up, he goes, checks Eli. Eli, what do you want? Eli says, I didn't call for you. Go back to bed. Samuel, Samuel! Samuel gets up, goes to Eli. Eli, you keep waking me up. What do you want? And Eli says, I didn't call for you. Go back to bed. So Samuel goes back to bed. However, on that last time, Eli says, you know what, Samuel? Maybe God's calling you. Next time you hear somebody call your voice, or call your name, say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. Ironically, the name Samuel means heard of God, right? Shmuel, right? Shema El, right? Because God heard Hannah's prayer, right? So he is heard of God, and now Eli says, whenever they say, heard of God, you say, speak, Lord. Your servant is Shemaiah. He's hearing. And so, sure enough, God calls out Samuel's name. And Samuel says, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. And lo and behold, God begins to speak to Samuel. And what he conveys to Samuel is not really good news. He conveys to Samuel that basically destruction is coming upon Eli's household. Right? And that destruction is very, very imminent. It's coming very, very soon. It is not going to be a fun time. And so, the next morning, whenever Samuel wakes up and opens up the doors, Eli confronts him and says, hey, so was that God? And Samuel says, yep, that was God. And Eli says, well, what's the news?
Oh.
And Samuel doesn't want to tell him. But he does, right? And so he tells him that basically destruction is coming on Eli and his household. And then Eli says, it is of Yahweh, let him do what seems good to him. Which to me, I think, once again, seems to highlight that Eli, he's very spiritually minded, but he doesn't seem to have much of a relationship with God. Right? Because we're going to see this, like, one thing that you'll see in Scripture is that every time God speaks, it's an opportunity for a conversation. Right? Whereas Eli, he simply just takes it, okay, like his response here sounds very holy, right? Oh, God has said it. It shall be done. All right. That sounds really good. But the thing is, you know what Eli should have done?
Okay.
He should have repented and said, God, please, I'm so sorry. I should have rebuked my sons more. I should have done more. Is there any way for you to show mercy to us, right? That's what Eli should have done.
Right.
And the reason we know that is because when you get to 2 Samuel, that's what David is going to do, right? Whenever God speaks through the prophet Nathan to condemn David, well, David's going to fall on his face and say, God, please forgive me. He's going to ask for forgiveness. Eli doesn't do that, though, right? Eli just says, it is of Yahweh, it shall be done. It's like, okay, yes, that sounds really nice and spiritual, but it seems like you're missing the whole point. God is calling you to repentance. He isn't calling you to just like fatalism. But then we read this in the following verses, right? So we see Eli and his household falling apart, but we read this about Samuel. Thus Samuel grew, and Yahweh was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. So all Israel, from Dan even to Beersheba, knew that Samuel was confirmed as a prophet of Yahweh. Dan to Beersheba, remember, is from north to south. Right? Dan is the northernmost point, Beersheba is the southernmost. And Yahweh appeared again at Shiloh, because Yahweh revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of Yahweh. So at this time period, the tabernacle is in Shiloh with the Ark of the Covenant, stuff like that. And so, yes, Eli and his family are fated for destruction, but Samuel is growing up as an amazing prophet of Yahweh. And some of my favorite words are right there. Right? Yahweh was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. This is one of my prayers every morning before I go teach my students at school. Right? God, let none of my words fall to the ground. Or anytime I go preach a sermon, or even right now whenever we're talking, right? It's like, let none of my words fall to the ground. The imagery is, you know, whenever people talk about words going in one ear and out the other, right? It's the idea, like, that's not what happened with Samuel, right? His words didn't go in one ear and out the other. Whenever he spoke, people listened because they knew he had something to say, right? And his words had an impact, right? I think that's really cool, right? It's such a beautiful description there. Let none of his words fall to the ground. There were no wasted words from Samuel. When he spoke, everybody listened because it needed to be heard, right? I pray that that's how all of us would be as Christians, especially whenever you go to like the book of James and it talks about how dangerous the tongue can be, right? We need to be very careful with our tongues, and Samuel's apparently very good about that. And so, as you read through the next chapters, really, chapters 4, 5, and 6 are really serving to, well, I guess really it's chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7 are showing us the fall of the house of Eli, followed by the rise of Samuel, right? And so really they're reinforcing the points that we have right here. What happens is this, and I can summarize these chapters pretty quickly. The Israelites go out to battle against the Philistines, right? So Philistines basically, the name Philistine literally means invader, right? They are these people who were invading inward. So if you were to imagine a map of Israel, you've got the Mediterranean Sea over here to the west, right? According to most historians, what we believe about the Philistines is that they were people who came from the sea, right? So we don't know where they came from. I mean, people speculate different things. Other traditions call them the sea peoples, right? They came down and they started invading inwards from the coast, right? And so if you actually look at a map, you'll notice that Philistia is right along the coast of the Mediterranean, and they're invading their way inwards. And they're going to be a big thorn in the side of Israel. We've seen this way back into like Judges and Joshua and stuff like that. But especially in 1st and 2nd Samuel, the Philistines are like the big bad guys. Whenever Israel isn't being their own big bad guy. Right? Sometimes Israel can be their own worst enemy. But in chapter 4, we get to see the Philistines and the Israelites going into battle with one another. And the Israelites lose the battle. And if you know the Torah, what does that tell us about Israel?
They're not trusting.
They're not being faithful to God. Right? They're not trusting in Him. However, that is not the lesson that the Israelites learn from this. Which makes sense because they're not being faithful to God. If they had been faithful to God, then they probably would have been like, oh, we need to repent. But they're not, right? And so, whenever they lose the battle, they conclude, you know what we need to do? We need to get the Ark of the Covenant and bring the Ark of the Covenant out here to battle. There's an issue with that, right? Because the thing is, they're treating the Ark of the Covenant like it's a magic totem, right? It's just like a weapon. Yeah, it's like a weapon, right? Oh, well, because one thing you have to understand about any battle in ancient times, it was never simply one country versus another country, right? The way that they viewed battles was a supernatural battle, right? So it wasn't one nation versus another nation, it was one God versus another God. And so if the Philistines win, that communicates that the Philistine God is more powerful, right? Normally, that's how they interpret it. The Israelites should not have interpreted it that way, because according to the Torah, there is nobody more powerful than Yahweh. The only reason that other people won is not because their God was more powerful, but it's because Israel was not being faithful to the all-powerful God, right? But the Israelites did not get that message. And so they said, okay, if we want to win this battle, we need to get the Ark of the Covenant out here, because we know that God's presence dwells in the Ark of the Covenant. And so that's what they do, right? They go get the Ark of the Covenant. Eli's sons bring the Ark of the Covenant out there to battle. And guess what happens?
Oh, I don't know, actually. It surprised me.
They lose the battle, and the Ark of the Covenant gets stolen. And Eli's 2 sons die.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Like God said they would.
Yes, just like God said they would. And so, whenever you actually read the end of the story in chapter 4, this is how you read it. Now a man of Benjamin ran from the battle line and came to Shiloh the same day with his clothes torn and dust on his head. When he came, behold, Eli was sitting on his seat by the road, eagerly watching, because his heart was trembling for the Ark of God. Right? So Eli is paranoid because, the Ark of the Covenant is out there at battle, and he's the high priest. And he's like, oh man, I do not want that Ark of the Covenant to get lost. Which probably communicates that you shouldn't have sent it out there to begin with, right? So that's the issue with Eli, right? It's not that he's necessarily unfaithful. It's just that he's very passive, right? And as a leader, you cannot be a passive person, right? He just let his corrupt sons bring the Ark of the Covenant out to battle, even though he knows they're not supposed to do that, right? That's the issue with Eli. He should have stopped them. Instead, he let them take the Ark out there, and now he's trembling because he's afraid that something might happen. So the man came to tell it to the city, and the city cried out. When Eli heard the noise of the outcry, he said, what does the noise of the commotion mean? Then the man came hurriedly and told Eli. Now Eli was 98 years old, and his eyes were set so that he could not see. The man said to Eli, I am the one who came from the battle line. Indeed, I escaped from the battle line today. And he said, how did things go, my son? Then the one who brought the news replied, Israel has fled before the Philistines. And moreover, there has been a great slaughter amongst the people. And moreover, your 2 sons also, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead. And moreover, the Ark of God has been taken. So each of those gets more extreme.
Yeah.
Everybody fled. And not only did everybody flee, a bunch of people were killed. And not only were a bunch of people killed, your 2 sons were killed. And not only were your 2 sons killed, the Ark of the Covenant's gone. God has been kidnapped.
What? Not literally.
When he mentioned the Ark of God, Eli fell off his seat backward beside the gate, and his neck was broken and he died, for he was old and heavy. Thus he judged Israel for 40 years. So Eli hears the news of the ark of God being taken. He falls backward and dies, right? Because he's a fat guy who lands on his head, neck snaps. So his sons and himself, they all die on the same day. And if that weren't bad enough, listen to this. Now his daughter-in-law, Phinehas' wife, right? So Phinehas is one of the sons that just died. She was pregnant and was about to give birth. And when she heard the news that the ark of God was taken and that her father-in-law and her husband had died, she kneeled down and gave birth, for her pains came upon her. And about the time of her death, the women who stood by her said to her, "Do not be afraid, for you have given birth to a son." But she did not answer or pay attention. And she called the boy Ichabod, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel, because the ark of God was taken, and because of her father-in-law and her husband." She said, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God was taken."
So that's what Ichabod means.
Yeah, Ichabod means the glory has departed, right? Kabod means glory, right? And so here you've got Eli, his two sons, and his daughter-in-law all dying on the same day. And with that death comes new life, but the only life that, the only name that life is given is the glory is gone, because the ark of God has been captured. When you get to chapters 5 and 6, though, you get to see that apparently God doesn't need anybody to win battles, right? It's actually really funny if you think about this in contrast to what just happened, because the people of Israel, they thought the reason they were losing battles was because God was too far away from them. Oh, well, God is, he's way over in Shiloh. Let's get the Ark of the Covenant and bring it here, and then we'll win battles. That's what they thought. Turns out, it's not about proximity at all. It's simply about faith. And what God's going to demonstrate in chapters 5 and 6 is that he can bring himself back, right? He can win battles all by himself. He can take care of the Philistines without the army ever raising up a sword. And so what happens is that the Philistines, they bring the Ark of the Covenant to one of their temples, and they put it next to the statue of their god Dagon. And whenever they come and check the temple the next day, Dagon has fallen forward, right? Like the statue has fallen over. What does it look like Dagon's doing?
Bowing down.
It looks like he's bowing down. And they're like, well, that's weird. So they put him back up. The next day they come out, and Dagon has not only fallen forward, but his head and his arms have popped off. So not only has Dagon bowed down before Yahweh, he's also died.
Well,
Yikes! And then to make matters worse, the Philistines start breaking out in these huge things, like which the Bible describes as tumors. I don't know if the word tumor there is the same thing that we think of when we think of tumor, but it's some sort of painful affliction. And they start breaking out in it. They're like, what the heck is going on? And after some time, they get rid of the Ark of the Covenant. They're like, okay, they sense that the Ark of the Covenant is their source of problems. And so they pick up the Ark of the Covenant, they ship it off to another city. Guess what happens there?
Oh boy.
Everybody breaks out in tumors as well. So they pick it up and move it to another city. And so basically the Ark of the Covenant is being hot potatoed from one Philistine city to another Philistine city. Until eventually the people say, you know what? This is more hassle than it's worth. What we're going to do is we are going to simply load up this ark onto a wagon. And we're going to attach this wagon to some cows. We're going to spank those cows, and we're going to let those cows take the Ark of the Covenant wherever it needs to be. And keep in mind, months have passed at this point, right? I think it's like 7 months have passed. And this whole time, the people of Israel have been grieving because the Ark of the Covenant has been lost, right? I mean, the issue, you have to realize that the Ark of the Covenant was more than simply a golden box, right? God's presence had genuinely come to dwell in some miraculous way in this thing.
Right.
The issue is that whenever they brought the Ark of the Covenant out to battle, they were treating God like a pagan god, right? That's the issue. They were treating the Ark of the Covenant like an idol, which it is not, right? But there is something significant about it. And so the people of Israel have been mourning. They have been crying out over this whole situation. The Philistines load the Ark of the Covenant up on the wagon. They spank the cows. The cows walk off. And then, over in Israel, there's just these dudes who are just farming one day. Just imagine the scene. It's so funny.
Okay.
They're just out there farming one day. They look up, and then some cows drag the Ark of the Covenant back into the city. And they just look up, and they're like, isn't that the Ark of the Covenant that we've been missing for months? Right?
Well, that's convenient.
So God, notice what he did here, right? The Israelites didn't do anything to get the Ark of the Covenant back. And even if they had tried, they probably couldn't have done anything because God's presence wasn't even with them anymore because they weren't being faithful. God brought himself back, right? What he's communicating is he's saying, I don't need you, right? He says, I can defeat the Philistines all by myself, right? Notice what he just did with the Ark of the Covenant. Now, all these different cities of the Philistines are populated by people with all these tumors and afflictions. He says, guys, I can take care of the Philistines without even getting out of my box, right? He says, all I need is for you to be faithful to me, right? But the issue is, there is no king in Israel. Everybody's doing what's right in his own eyes, right? And so that continues to be the ongoing issue here. But the Ark of the Covenant does eventually return to Israel. And then what we see is that Samuel really does rise to the forefront, and he leads this amazing revival throughout the land, right? And he actually, like now he's a grown man and stuff like that, he actually calls the people back to God, and together they do subdue the Philistines. And there's this huge revival where people begin to worship Yahweh. And it looks like things are making a turn for the better, and everything's going great. And we read in chapter 7, verse 15, Now Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. He used to go annually on circuit to Bethel and Gilgal and Mizpah. Then he judged Israel in all these places. Then his return was to Ramah, for his house was there. And there he judged Israel. And he built an altar to Yahweh. And so, we see the fall of Eli's house and the rise of Samuel. But we can tell that something's about to change. Right? We know that, this is a heads up whenever you're reading the Bible. Whenever things like they're going really, really well, when things look like they're going really, really well, you know that something's going to happen in the near future. And this is just true whenever you're reading any story. Right? Have you ever watched a movie like that? Where you're watching it and you're like, wow, everything's going so great. And then like you feel this like anticipation building up in your chest because you're like, oh, something's going to ruin this. That's kind of what the Bible has taught me to do a little bit. Because the thing is, humans are sinful. And whenever everything's going great, what they love to do is they like to add some drama to life. And so, whenever we get to 1 Samuel chapter 8, the people of Israel are going to ask for a king. Right? Here Samuel is, this faithful prophet of God, this faithful priest, this faithful judge, who has risen up and he has presided over the people. He has led a revival. He has delivered them from their enemies. Everything's going great. And in the midst of all of this, they ask for a king. 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 4. All the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. And they said to him, Behold, you have grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Another thing about Samuel is that his sons, like Eli's sons, were not very faithful. And this is going to be an ongoing thing throughout Samuel. There's really not any good father figures in the book of Samuel. Behold, you have grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king for us to judge us like all the nations. Now there's a few issues with this. Two primary ones. What are the issues?
A king and like the nations.
Yeah, king and like the nations, right? Those are the two issues. What's the issue with the king part?
God's supposed to be the king.
Yes, Yahweh is supposed to be their king, right? This is made very clear throughout the Torah, right? Yahweh is their king. He is the lawgiver, right? Why would they need a king? But then they explain why they want a king. Why do they want a king?
To judge us like all the nations.
To judge like all the nations. What's the issue with that?
God is a judge.
Yes, if you were to summarize Israel's calling in one word, it would be the word holy. If you were to define the word holy in two words, it would be set apart. Right? Israel's one job is to not be like the nations.
Right.
Yet they come up to Samuel and say, Hey Samuel, we love everything you're doing, man. But you're getting old, you're not going to be around here forever. And whenever we look at the nations around us, we can't help but notice they all have kings. And we don't have a king. We would love to have a king to judge us. Right? Because you've been a great judge. But we need a king. Right? That's how you know you're a real nation. But the thing was evil in the sight of Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to Yahweh. Right? So Samuel hears this and he immediately is turned off by this idea. He's like, ooh, this does not sit well with me. But Yahweh said to Samuel, Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. So Yahweh subtly rebukes Samuel here, because God knows the heart. And he says, hey Samuel, I get that you're upset over this, but I don't want you to take it personally. Because you're upset because the people seem to have rejected you, but I just want to be clear, that's not what they're doing here. They love you, Samuel. You've been a great judge. What they have done is they've rejected me. Right? And so God calls us out for what it is. It is a rejection of him in priority of they actually want a king that they can see. And what this is going to set in motion is what we are going to call the monarchy or the kingdom of Israel. Right? And so Samuel is the final judge, and going forward, Israel is going to be ruled by kings. And I would argue that this is even to this day. It just so happens that they have had the same king for about 2,000 years now, even if they have not recognized that. So what we're going to have here is that we see that we enter into what I would say is a very awkward time period for the people of Israel. Because what you'll notice is that God said that they rejected him as being king, which means that God is their king. And all because they rejected him as king, does that mean he's going to stop being king? No, right? He has made an eternal covenant with them, right? And so, whenever he declared them his people back in the wilderness, he made himself king over them, and they accepted him as king. And really, that goes way back even into Genesis with Abraham, right? So God is the king of Israel, and that's going to be an ongoing thing, right? And so through the wilderness time period, through the book of Judges, and even into Samuel, we have God residing as king over Israel. But now, theologically, this is a very confusing thing. Because now not only are they going to have God as their king, but there's also now going to be a human king presiding over them as well. Right? It's going to start with Saul, then it's going to go to David, then it's going to go to Solomon, and onwards and onwards and onwards. So now what you have here is you have two kings reigning over one nation. And that is going to be the source of Israel's conflict for a very long time. Because ultimately, which king has the greater authority? God, right? And it makes the human king put in a weird place because you have to figure out what is the human king's job, right? Like if there's already a king, then what is my role as king, right? I mean, because God already gave the law, God is the one who governs them. You got to figure out what exactly the human king's job is. And unfortunately for King Saul, the first king, he's probably going to get the brunt of this, to where he doesn't really know what he's doing, right? He's trying to figure it all out, and as a result, he's going to be an epic failure, right? But by and large, it really just makes things tricky. And as you read through the rest of the Old Testament, you're going to realize that most of the conflict that we see in the story is because the two kings of Israel are in conflict with one another, right? You've got Yahweh in conflict with the human kings. Whenever the human and divine king are seeing eye to eye, things are going great, right? Whenever David is chasing after God, things are fine. Whenever Solomon is chasing after God, things are amazing. But whenever the human king rejects Yahweh as king, that's when things go badly. And so, through the monarchy, all the way through the Old Testament, and even into the New Testament, you've got really this two kingship thing going on here, which is very confusing. But this is the genius of God. Because he's going to fix this, isn't he? Because when you get to the New Testament, the final Messiah shows up. And you know who this Messiah is?
Jesus.
He's Jesus, and he just so happens to be truly God and truly man. So the monarchy is once again unified, right? So you have Yahweh coming in the flesh, being born of the seed of David, so that the human and the divine realms are once again reunited, and once again Israel only has one king. Which I just think is pretty cool, right? Just the more I reflect on it, I'm oh, God is so smart, right? Because he has to think, one big thing you're going to see throughout the whole Bible is that God is constantly trying to fix man's problems. And man just screws up again and again and again and again and again. And so, whenever man does something that screws things up, you got to figure out, what is God going to do to resolve this? And this whole request that they're making Samuel here puts God in a weird place. Because God has no desire to force himself upon people. And so if they reject him as king, he will allow them to do that, and he will give them a king. But he also has a covenant to fulfill. And so in some way, he has to make it work out that they can have a human king, but he also can reside as king. And eventually that conflict has to come to an end. And so how does he resolve it? Well, he comes down in the flesh, being born of a virgin. And I don't know, it's brilliant. It's just, God is a genius.
Ties together well.
Yes.
And more than a genius, he's the creator of the universe.
Yep. Before they appoint the king, though, Samuel gives the people a warning. Right? What word do you see highlighted in red there? Take. He says, guys, God is going to give you a king, just like you've asked, but I am going to warn you, the king is going to take everything from you. Right? He's going to take your sons and send them off to war. He's going to take your daughters and marry them and throw them into his harem. Right? He's going to take your land and make it his own, make it a summer house. He's going to take your money and have you pay it as taxes. He's going to take. He says this is what human governments do. They are corrupt, and they're not like God. Right? Because you know what God's communicated so far? He doesn't need big armies. Right? Think about that. Remember Gideon? Right? Gideon got together 32,000 people for battle, and God said, I just need 300. That means that you have 30,000 people who get to go back to their families and who didn't have to go to war. That's really cool. But that's not how human kings work, right? Human kings, they say, I want a bigger army. And so, there's a lot of people who don't need to go to battle who end up going to battle and dying. Because human kings, they want a bigger army, right? God, he doesn't need a big army. He says, you know what? Keep your kids at home. I'll win this battle. All I need is your faith, right? Human kings, they demand taxes. God doesn't need taxes, right? Human kings, they demand wives. God doesn't need wives, right? And so he says, guys, God will give you what you want, but if you want a king like the nations, I will warn you, you will get a king like the nations, right? Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The only person who's exempt from that is God himself, right? But even the best of kings will still be a man at best, right? And even David is not going to be exempt from this. David's greatest sin involves him taking something that was not his own.
Right.
And so, when you get to the next few chapters, we do get to meet this guy named Saul. Right? He is from the tribe of Benjamin. He comes from the city of Gibeah, which, if you recall, Gibeah was the city that we saw at the end of the book of Judges, which was basically the Sodom of Israel. Basically, whenever you read the end of the book of Judges, there's this horrible event where this woman is brutally assaulted out in the city, and that is the city of Gibeah. And as a result, nearly the entire tribe of Benjamin is wiped out because of a civil war resulting at the end of all that. Saul is from that city. And so the main things you need to know about King Saul, whenever you're going into these chapters, is that King Saul is a very good-looking guy, right? He is a very tall individual, a head taller than everybody else, and he is from the Sodom of Israel, right? You can't get more worldly than that, right? This is a guy who looks like a politician, he acts like a politician, and he's from the most corrupt city in the whole land. There you go. Perfect. It's exactly what the people asked for, but it's not what God's looking for, right? But God appoints Saul, and there's multiple chapters that detail exactly how Saul is appointed and stuff like that. For right now, we'll just kind of skip a lot of that just for the sake of time. But Saul does eventually become king, and he even starts off his reign pretty decently. Whenever you get to 1 Samuel chapter 11, Saul actually has a victory over the Ammonites by getting together this huge army and going out and winning, and it's a great moment, right? And everybody's like, wow, Saul is great. But even the way that he goes about getting that army together, not the greatest, right? What we're going to see about Saul is that from a physical and worldly perspective, he's very capable as a leader. From a spiritual perspective, he does not seem to have a spiritual bone in his body. And the only thing he's concerned about from a spiritual perspective is how people perceive him. He wants people to think that he is very religious and devout, when really he doesn't care much about God at all. So the way that Saul actually gets together that army is he basically cuts one of his own bulls into 12 pieces and ships it throughout the land, which sounds a lot like what happened at the end of the book of Judges, right? And he basically says, come fight in my battle, or I'll do this to all of your livestock as well. So basically saying, give me your sons to fight in battle, or else I will take everything else you have from you, and your whole family will die from starvation. So he starts off, I mean, it works, right? He gets together a huge army, they go and win, it's awesome, but we see that he's kind of a tyrant, right? Physically, he's capable. Spiritually, not the most righteous person in the world. In 1 Samuel chapter 12, Samuel does address the people again, and he basically just recaps and says, hey guys, I have given you the king you've asked for. Just be very careful for what you do going forward, because God's eyes are on you and he's going to be testing you to see what you do. Which then leads to 1 Samuel chapter 13, where we are going to see that very quickly Saul is rejected as king. The door's unlocked. Yeah. So very quickly, Saul is going to be rejected as king, just because. This was basically inevitable, right? Because yes, God is gracious, and He is going to give the people what they ask for, but ultimately, He is faithful to His covenant, and He is going to give the people what they need, right? And so while they asked for a king like the nations, He tolerated that for a little bit. Oh, I forgot that was what you're getting delivered. So he did tolerate the request, and he did give them what they asked for. He gave them a king like the nations, but God is too gracious to leave it like that, right? And he loves his people too much to leave them only there. And so very quickly, Saul is going to be rejected, and God is going to set in motion plans for somebody else to replace Saul. There's two main things that Saul does incorrectly. The first thing is that Saul offers a sacrifice he is not supposed to offer. Right, so basically the way this goes is that they're getting ready to go to battle, and Samuel was supposed to meet them at the battlefield so that they could offer a sacrifice to Yahweh before they went out into battle to go fight. However, Samuel shows up a little bit late. And so Saul, he's sitting there waiting, biding his time, and he says, you know what? I'm going to offer a sacrifice. And as the flames and the smoke are rising into the air, guess who shows up? Samuel. But this highlights what I've already kind of pointed out, right? Saul finds himself in a very weird spot, right? Because as a king, he's trying to figure out what exactly is my role, right? Because normally kings can do whatever they want. And in many cultures, kings function as priests, right? To where, the role of king and priest were very intermixed in a lot of ancient cultures. And so Saul, he says, okay, well, I'm a king. I guess that means I can offer the sacrifice. But that's not how this works. Because according to the Torah, there's only one group of people who are allowed to offer sacrifices. Who is it? What tribe?
Levites.
The Levites. Right? Only the Levites, only the priests are allowed to offer sacrifices. Well, Samuel shows up and says, hey dude, what the heck? And Saul responds and says, well, you can't blame me. You were late, and we needed to offer a sacrifice. However, Saul is treating Yahweh the same way that Eli's sons treated Yahweh, right? Because he's thinking that, he's treating Yahweh like a pagan god. If only I have the Ark of the Covenant near to me, I can win this battle. If only I offer this sacrifice, I can win this battle. But that's not what God wants. God wants your heart, right? He doesn't want simply a sacrifice. And so, Samuel says to Saul, you have acted foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of Yahweh your God, which he commanded you. For now Yahweh would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not endure. Yahweh has sought out for himself a man after his own heart, and Yahweh has appointed him as ruler over his people, because you have not kept what Yahweh commanded you. He says, dude, you could have had everything. You could have had it all. But you missed the heart of God. And so, God's going to get somebody who is not going to miss his heart. He's going to get somebody who is chasing after his heart. And we don't know who this guy is yet, but it makes you really want to meet him, doesn't it? You read this, you're like, ooh, who's this guy going to be? A man after God's own heart. That's high praise. And you're just waiting for this guy to show up. You get to 1 Samuel chapter 14, and you get to see Saul mess up in other ways, but Samuel doesn't confront him on this one, so we're just going to kind of glaze over it for now. But in 1 Samuel chapter 14, what you do get to see is you do get to meet Saul's son Jonathan. who is amazing. Jonathan is one of the less popular heroes of the Bible who I really feel bad for Jonathan, because whenever you look at Jonathan, you realize this guy probably could have made a very good king. But his dad was so unfaithful that he never got a chance, which is sad. 1 Samuel chapter 15, Saul makes yet another boo-boo. They're supposed to go out, and they're fighting against the Amalekites. And if you remember, the Amalekites were the very first people to oppose Israel once they got out of Egypt. Right? So back in the book of Exodus, whenever they were on their way to Mount Sinai, the Amalekites are the ones who confronted them. And remember that you have that story with Moses having to raise up his hand, and they're having to support his arm during the battle. Do y'all remember that? Well, God said that he was going to wipe the Amalekites off the face of the planet. And the Amalekites are, like, just throughout Scripture, the Amalekites are a thorn in Israel's flesh because they keep coming back. And so, Samuel tells Saul, wipe out the Amalekites. Right? According to the Torah, that's what they're supposed to do. And now he says, make sure that you kill all of them. Every man, every woman, every child, every animal. Kill them all. Well, Saul goes and they win the battle, but he spares the king of the Amalekites, and he spares the animals. And so, Samuel shows up and says, hey, Saul, I thought that I asked you, or I thought I told you to kill everything. And Saul says, I've done what Yahweh has asked me to do.
It's a bare minimum.
Yeah, well, and Samuel says, well, no, if you've done what God asked you to do, why is it that I hear the sound of bulls and goats in my ears? Because if you'd done what I asked you to do, I wouldn't hear any of that stuff.
Yep.
And Saul says, oh, well, it was the men, honestly. Sorry, it was the soldiers. They just were so grateful for what Yahweh had done for them out in the battlefield that they wanted to save these animals to sacrifice to Yahweh. And once again, it's the same issue, right? Saul wants to look very righteous, but he doesn't actually care about God, right? It was the same thing in chapter 13, right? Oh, well, we knew we couldn't go into battle without offering a sacrifice to Yahweh. It's like, no. That's not what you're wanting to do, right? Same thing here in chapter 15. They were not actually wanting to sacrifice those animals to Yahweh. What were they wanting to do?
The motivation was...
Well, they were wanting to keep the animals for themselves, and Saul wanted to keep the king alive so he could parade the king as a prisoner of war throughout the streets. Right? Because think about it. If you kill a king in the middle of a battle, you have glory for a day. Right? Oh, yes, King Saul killed King Agag. Awesome. If you take that king as a prisoner and make him your slave, oh, you have glory for months and years to come. Right? Because every day when people see that king being marched throughout the streets, they can be reminded of what you did in battle. Right? So Saul wanted the glory for himself. But he presents it like he was trying to be righteous here. Oh, we just want to offer a sacrifice to God. And this is where Samuel says, Hine Shema Misebachto. Behold, to hear is better than to sacrifice. He says, Saul, God doesn't want your sacrifices. He wants you to hear him. When he says to do something, you need to do it. All because you're king does not mean that he is no longer king. Right? Your job is to point the people to him. Your job is not to be like other kings who do whatever they want. Your job is to serve God. Right? The Shema applies to you too. You shall love Yahweh your God with all of your heart, your soul, and your strength. That isn't just for the common people, that is for you. To hear is better than to sacrifice. And Samuel said, I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of Yahweh, and Yahweh has rejected you from being king over Israel. And then Samuel turned to go, but Saul seized the edge of his robe, and it tore. So Samuel said to him, Yahweh has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today, and has given it to your neighbor who is better than you. Also the eternal one of Israel will not lie or have regret, for he is not a man that he should have regret. So as he turns to go, Saul reaches out, begging him, no, don't leave. And Samuel's robe rips. One thing you know about Samuel is that whenever he was a kid, his mom would visit him every year and give him a new robe. Right? So Samuel's always associated with his robes. The robe rips. And without missing a beat, Samuel turns around and says, you know how you just ripped that robe from me? So God has ripped the kingdom from you. And not only that, he's already picked out who he's going to give the kingdom to. And this guy is way better than you will ever be. And then Samuel departs, and we read that him and Saul never see each other again, I believe. Is that at the end of chapter 15? Yeah.
Unless, that was
Yeah.
chapter 15.
Well, technically they don't see each other.
It says until the day of his death. So, yes. Which then sets us up to meet David.
Yes.
Man.
We've had all these chapters of build up, right? And what's interesting so far is that we haven't met David yet, right? What we've read is that there is this person who's coming who is going to be a man after God's own heart. He is going to be better than Saul. He is going to hear, and he's going to pay attention to what God wants. He's going to grasp the heart of God. So even before we're introduced to David, we know that this dude's going to be special, and he's going to be set apart. And so as you read through the rest of 1 Samuel and through 2 Samuel, every single time David shows up on the page, you're supposed to be asking, what is it that makes this guy different? What happens is that Samuel is very grieved over Saul, because even though Samuel was reluctant to appoint a king over Israel, he was very zealous for God. And so once God appointed a king, he came to love that king. And so now that Saul's been rejected, Samuel is sad. But God says, Samuel, it's time to suck it up, get up, and go appoint a new king. So Samuel goes down to the city of Bethlehem, where he goes to the family of a guy named Jesse, and he says, hey, one of your sons is going to be the new king. And this is a pretty crazy moment if you think about it. Like, whenever Samuel shows up, everybody's asking, do you come in peace? Do you come in peace? Because, gossip spreads, and everybody knows that Samuel and Saul had a big falling out. The two most important and powerful people in the land are not on speaking terms anymore. Right? Samuel and Saul, no talking. Samuel all of a sudden shows up in Bethlehem, and everybody's like, do we want a part in this? And he says, yes, I come in peace. I want to hang out with Jesse. And so they go get Jesse and stuff. And then imagine how Jesse, like the blood probably just drained from Jesse's face whenever Samuel says, hey, one of your sons is going to be the new king of Israel.
Huh.
Well, there's an issue with that, because typically who becomes the king after one king?
A son.
Usually his son. And we already know that Saul has a son, and he's a pretty good guy, Jonathan. And Saul has other sons beyond that. And so, whenever Samuel shows up here and talks to Jesse, what he's basically doing is he's inviting him to what we would call treason. However, Saul's been rejected by God. And God is the true king of Israel. Right? And so, what Saul might consider treason, Samuel would call faithfulness. And we would call faithfulness. Right? Because he is being faithful to the true king of Israel. And so he shows up to Jesse and says, one of your sons is going to be the new king of Israel. And so Jesse goes and gets all of his sons. They come before Samuel. And Samuel sees the first son and says, holy moly, this has got to be the new king. Because he's tall, dark, and handsome, right? Picture perfect politician. And God says, don't look at the man's outward appearance. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but Yahweh looks upon the heart. So he doesn't say that outward appearance is bad. He just simply says outward appearance is not the most important thing.
It doesn't define the spiritual qualities of the person.
No, yeah. He's just saying, hey, outward appearance is neutral. It can be good, it can be bad. What is essential is character. Right? Everybody thought that Saul was the bee's knees because he looked awesome. He says, I don't care how this person looks. I care about his heart. So Samuel goes one by one through Jesse's sons, but none of them are the one. And so now Samuel's really confused, and he's like, well, hold up. Now, I've been thrown through a loop here, because I know that one of your sons has to be the future king, but none of them were picked. And he says, Jesse, this might sound like a weird question, but is there another son that maybe you just didn't bring out? And Jesse says, well, yeah, my youngest son, he's a shepherd. And so he says, go get him. Out comes David.
Yep.
And as soon as Samuel sees him, he says, that's the boy. He anoints him, and he becomes the anointed one over Israel. But he's not going to become king immediately, right? David's probably 13 or 14 when this happens. He's not going to become king till he's 30 years old. And so, time passes. And now that God's Spirit has come to dwell in David, God's Spirit has departed from King Saul. and an evil spirit comes to plague Saul. As Saul starts going into all these fits of rage and stuff like that. And so eventually, to calm him down, the people say, you know what? We need to get somebody to come in here and play an instrument for Saul just to soothe his emotions. And somebody goes by and says, well, hey, there's this really good harpist from down in Bethlehem. We could go get him. Guess who it is? David. And this is the interesting part here, right? Because here you've got David over here, just some random hillbilly from backwoods Bethlehem. And now he's the future king of Israel, and you're wondering, how's he going to end up on the throne? And then by the end of that same chapter, he is in the throne room playing music for the king. And you're like, ooh, what's happening here? Right? And so David comes to play music for Saul, and we read that Saul loved David dearly. And David even became Saul's armor bearer. Right? And so David goes back and forth between the shepherd's fields and the king's palace. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Which then leads us into David's claim to fame. 1 Samuel chapter 17. The Israelites go out to battle against the Philistines again. And this time the Philistines decide they want to take a different approach. Rather than going out and just blooding the battlefield, they say, how about this? We'll do a 1v1, mano-a-mano, winner-take-all fight. You send out your best fighter, we'll send out our best fighter, and whoever wins that battle, the losing side, they become slaves to the winning side. It's a lot easier, right? Economically, makes a lot of sense, right? Rather than killing everybody and having to clean up all those bodies, let's just have one death, and then everybody else just goes over the other side. A lot easier. The issue is, the Philistines have a 10-foot-tall giant on their side named Goliath. So he comes forward and he starts saying, oh, come and fight me, you dogs. And he starts like teasing them and stuff like that. And everybody's terrified. And they are freaking out. And nobody will go fight him. And if you think about it, who is the first person who should have gone out there and fought? Saul. Because one thing that we know is that first off, Saul is the king. And so he should defend his people. And secondly, we know that he's a head taller than everybody else. And so if anybody was physically equipped to go fight this guy, it'd be Saul. But that's not what Saul is going to do. Instead, Saul disappears from the scene. And for 40 days, Goliath comes forward and taunts the people. Again and again and again. But then one day, David's over in the shepherd's field, and, his dad says, hey, your brothers are off at war with King Saul. Here's some cheese. Go bring your brothers some food. And so David goes, and he goes out to bring his brother some food, and lo and behold, the giant comes out to make his taunt. And it's the same as every day before, but this time Goliath makes one fatal mistake. He makes this announcement within David's earshot. And here's where we get to see what it means to be a man after God's own heart. 1 Samuel 17 is the very first time we ever see David speak. And I love whenever the Bible lets you hear like what a person has to say. And especially the first words. They let you know a lot about a character. And here, right off the bat, we get to see what makes David a man after God's own heart just in this one story right here. Right? First off, we see his zeal for God. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should reproach the battle lines of the living God? He's zealous for God. His brothers hear David so confidently mocking Goliath, and they say, David, you're just a boy. Go back home. You don't know what you're talking about. And he says, what have I done now? Was it not just a word? He's innocent. Right? He's like, guys, I just don't get how y'all are tolerating this stupid giant doing all this stuff. But then David goes before King Saul. And he says, let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. We get to see that David's a natural leader. Right? Notice what he's concerned about. He isn't concerned with his own pride. He says he's concerned about the people. He sees the people's heart failing. They are sheep without a shepherd. And their shepherd, King Saul, is not stepping up. So David says, I will do what needs to be done. Let no man's heart fail him. I will fight the giant. But if you think about this is kind of funny. Imagine that a married couple was at home and they have a newborn baby. And somebody went to break into their house, right? And the man and his wife are absolutely terrified to go and fight the person who's breaking into their house. And then imagine if their newborn baby walked up there and said, "Don't worry, Mom and Dad, I got this."
Really? Okay.
You'd probably look at the baby and you'd probably be a little bit embarrassed that your baby is more courageous than you are, but you'd also think that your baby's in way over his head.
Right.
Yep.
But that's what David's doing here, right?
Okay.
Here you've got all these soldiers who are peeing their pants
They're crazy.
because they don't want to fight Goliath. King Saul is peeing his pants because he doesn't want to fight Goliath. And then some random hillbilly shepherd shows up and he's just a teenager. He's like, "I'll do it." Calm down, everybody. No need to be afraid. I'm here. But we see he's a natural leader. And then Saul says, "David, buddy, you can't do this. You're but a youth, and this guy's been training for battle since he was a youth." And David says, "Yahweh, who delivered me from the hand of the lion and from the hand of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." He places his confidence not in himself, but in God. He says, "Saul, I don't think you understand what I'm saying. I'm not saying that I can win the battle. I'm saying that God can." He says, "God's got this." And so, as they're having this whole back and forth, Saul eventually decides that he will let David go fight the battle. Which is really ironic because according to the rules of the battle, it's a winner-take-all situation. And so Saul willingly entrusts the future of Israel into David's hands. Ironically, he kind of hands the kingship over to David in this moment. Because David is willing to fight the battle that he himself was not willing to fight. But it also makes sense why he would probably do this because if it came to close combat fighting, nobody stands a chance against Goliath. Right? Because he's too big. And so if they're going to win the battle, what's their one chance?
I'm guessing.
If it can't be close combat, what's it have to be? Long range, right? It's got to be further away. Well, it turns out that David, being a shepherd, is really good with a sling. And so, if they're he's young, he's fast, he's quick. If they've got a chance against Goliath, it's going to be from a guy with a sling. And so Saul puts his trust in David. But he says, "You know what, David? Just to be safe, take my armor." But there's an issue, right? David's a little teeny bopper, and Saul is a head taller than everybody else. So the armor doesn't fit him.
Right.
But David said to Saul, "I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them." He's like, "This armor won't work for me. I haven't tested it out. I'd be better without the armor." Because the one person he has
Is the armor
tried it. He's got the armor of God, basically, right? Yeah, because God has got him through all the other tests in the past. He's like, "That's the only armor I need." Right? So his faith is one that is relying totally in God. Right? Once again, as David is saying all these things, you're having to say, what is it that makes him a man after God's own heart? Right? Throughout 1 Samuel so far, we have seen people who have been trusting in chariots and horses and soldiers. David says, "I don't need armor. I don't need a sword. All I need is God." Right? So we're getting to see the nature of his faith here. And so David goes out there. He picks up 5 smooth stones by a creek. He goes out with his walking staff, like a shepherd's staff. And Goliath sees him. And Goliath begins mocking him and says, "Oh, what am I, a dog that you come at me with sticks? Who do you think you are?" And to paraphrase David's response, he says, "Yes, you are a dog to me." Right? Goliath says, "Am I a joke?" And David says, "Yeah, I find you funny." And this is what David says. "You come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of Yahweh of hosts, the God of the battle lines of Israel, whom you have reproached. This day Yahweh will deliver you up into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you. I will give the dead bodies of the camp of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that Yahweh does not save by sword or by spear, for the battle is Yahweh's, and he will give you into our hands."
Just blatantly announcing it.
Yeah. I just love it.
Great.
Here you've got this little teenager, right? I mean, David's probably like 5 foot tall, right? Facing off against Goliath, who's 10 foot tall. Standing across the valley, and David says, "Hey, I'm going to tell you how this battle's going to go. First off, I'm going to take this little stone, and I'm going to throw it, and it's going to hit you right here in the head. Then I'm going to come over there, I'm going to take your own sword, I'm going to chop your head off with it, and then your army's going to flee. And I know we said that we were just going to take you as slaves. We don't want y'all as slaves. And so what we're going to do is we're going to slice down your entire army, and then the beasts and the birds of the field and the air are going to die fabulously tonight on your flesh. And there's nothing you can do about it.
Alright.
Because Yahweh doesn't need swords. He doesn't need soldiers. And we don't need those things either. We just need him. So, good luck. And so David runs into the battle, and sure enough, it goes exactly how David says, right? The battle, I mean, there's all these like verses after verse of build up. David wins the battle in about 10 seconds.
Right.
It says that Goliath started walking towards him, and David started running towards Goliath. Right? David's just eager. He's like, boom, battle's over. I would have loved to have been there.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Imagine the silence that fell over everything, right? Because, everybody's, chanting ahead of time, like, everybody's getting excited. And then David goes out there, and the Philistines think that this is going to be the easiest thing in the world, right? This trained soldier, this giant facing off against a teenager without armor. And then next thing you know, 10 seconds later, David's standing there with Goliath's head in his hand. And it probably just got silent, and it was probably comedic in a very dark way.
Right.
They just all turn and start running. And when you get to chapters 18 and 19, you get to see David's rise to fame. Right? Overnight, David is a sensation in Israel. He is on the cover of every Teen Bop magazine of the ancient times. Every guy wants to be him. Every girl wants to be with him. This is who David is. And when you get to chapters 18 and 19, you just can't get enough of David. Right? Everybody loves this guy. Right? What we see is that at the end of chapter 17, Saul gets his commander-in-chief Abner and says, "Hey, Abner, who's this David guy?" Right? I mean, I know he's been playing music for me, but who is he? This teenager just took down a giant. Right? And over the course of the next chapters, you get to see that Saul's son, Jonathan, becomes best friends with David. Saul's daughter, Michal, she marries David. Right? Saul's servants, they love David. Saul's people, they love David. Whenever David comes in from battle, the people sing his praises. They say, Saul has killed his thousands, David has killed his tens of thousands. And Saul starts to get jealous. Right? Saul loved David too. But Saul loves his power more. And as David grows into this sensation, Saul cannot stand it. Right? And so Saul begins to get very jealous. He gets envious. And he starts turning against David. And on several occasions, while David is playing music for him, because David is just cool. Right? So not only is he a soldier, but he's still playing music in Saul's courts. Right? I mean, think about it. He's everything that the girls are looking for, right? He's this macho man who's this soldier, elite fighting force guy, but he's also in touch with his emotions, and he writes music, and he's the leader of a band, right? And he's a shepherd. He's an outdoors guy, but he can just do everything, right? On several occasions, while he's playing music for Saul tries to kill David. He starts throwing spears at him, but David's also a ninja, and he escapes, right? But it becomes increasingly evident that it's not a safe place to be. And David could kill Saul, and everybody would support him with that, honestly. Because Saul has become increasingly tyrannical, and David is winning the hearts of the people. And if David led rebellion, people probably would follow him. But David is a man of principles, and he says that he will not lay his hand on the Lord's anointed one. And so he says, I'm not going to do it. And so what he decides to do is he decides to flee. Because David knows, he's been given this promise that God will put him on the throne. Right? And so he trusts that will one day happen, and he will end up on the throne. But when that day comes, it's going to have to be God who puts him there, not himself. Right? He doesn't want anybody to think that he put himself on the throne.
Right.
And so David flees, and he trusts that in time, God will put him there. And chapters 20 through 31 of Samuel are David on the run. Right? So the rest of 1 Samuel is just David on the run and his various different exploits. And I'm going to summarize this very quickly so that we can get to David's actual reign. But these are probably some of the most exciting chapters of Samuel, which makes me feel bad that we're going to just summarize it so quickly.
Yeah.
But during these chapters, David becomes more of what I would describes a Robin Hood figure, where David, he goes down into the wilderness on the run from Saul, and Saul's chasing after him for probably 10 to 12 years. Right? So David goes from being probably 18 years old to 30 years old during this time period. And he starts gathering together a group of merry men, right? They're actually known as the mighty men, the Giborim in Hebrew. And David basically takes all these people who were outcasts, right? People who had been experiencing the heavy yoke of Saul's tyranny. And those people flock to David. And they join him on the run. And he takes this group of misfits and turns them into a mighty fighting force, right? And Israel in exile, right? So under King Saul, we always see Saul turning into like this new Pharaoh-like figure who is bringing the people under oppression. And David is creating this like pocket Israel that is the true Israel devoted to God. And even while David is on the run trying to save his own life, he is employing his band of mighty men to go out and help the lowly and the oppressed of Israel. And so he'll appoint them to be bodyguards of people and to take care of them and to take care of their needs. And in the midst of all that, he's also on the run from King Saul. Right? So King Saul is so blinded by his hatred for David that he's allowing the whole nation to fall apart. Right? So the Philistines are gaining further and further ground, and they're moving further and further inland. And Saul is just laser focused on taking out David. Whereas David, while being a fugitive, is taking better care of the people than Saul ever did. Right? So David is just amazing throughout all of this, and we get to see just how truly great David is. Were you going to say something?
He had opportunities to kill him, and he did.
Yes, on several occasions, David finds himself in a position where he could kill King Saul. But he chooses not to. Right? And he says, I will not put my hand against the Lord's Mashiach. Right? The Lord's anointed one. Whenever you read 1st and 2nd Samuel, and you also read the Psalms, you see that David has a very high theology of the Messiah, the Mashiach. Right? You do not touch the Lord's Mashiach because he is specifically, he's protected by God. And so once again, David says, okay, like, it makes 1 Samuel very dramatic. Because you know that Saul has to die for David to become king. But you also know that David's not willing to do it. So in many ways, it's very anticlimactic from a narrative perspective. Because, I mean, this is like, imagine you're reading the Harry Potter books. And, you know, the whole story is Harry versus Voldemort, Harry versus Voldemort, Harry versus Voldemort. And then you got to the last book, and, like, some random person took out Voldemort. You'd be like, wait, what? Like, it seems kind of anticlimactic. But here you've got David versus Saul, David versus Saul, David versus Saul. But David makes it clear, I will not kill King Saul. And so now you've got to figure out a way for Saul to die and David to be raised up without David having to be the one to do it. And so God's going to have to work behind the scenes again. Fast forward 10 to 12 years, you get to the end of this whole section, and Saul goes to fight against the Philistines again. And at this point, the Philistines have conquered so much land that like they're they're north. Like they're getting close to the Galilee region. They're in like the Jezreel Valley, which if you look at a map, it's like way further than the Philistines ever usually get. Saul has allowed the kingdom to fall apart because of how blinded he is by his lust for killing David. And finally, at long last, Saul cries out to God. He says, God, help me. And he inquires of the Lord. But it's too little too late. Right? He waited so long to finally call out to God that God doesn't answer. And so what Saul does is he decides that he's going to inquire of somebody, and he says, okay, well, maybe if God won't speak to me, Samuel will speak to me. The issue is Samuel's already dead. Right? Samuel's been dead a long time at this point. And so what Saul does is in the middle of the night, he escapes into enemy territory. He creeps in there in disguise, and he contacts, hey Maverick, he contacts a witch, a necromancer. And he says, hey, I want you to call up the spirit of the prophet Samuel. And the woman says, oh, well, King Saul has made it illegal to perform necromancy. And he says, it's okay, just do it. And so the woman, she calls forth the spirit of Samuel, and it actually works.
Whoa.
Right? The dead spirit of Samuel shows up, and Samuel's upset. He's like, what? You won't even let me die? And Saul says, Samuel, I'm sorry. I just needed to talk to you because, like, I don't know. I've been trying to talk to God and God won't answer me. And I don't know. We always had a relationship. You at least talk to me. What's going to happen tomorrow at the battle? And Samuel says, let's just say that you'll be joining me very soon.
Uh-oh.
Right? So basically he tells Saul that he's going to die. And so Saul goes to battle the next day. And sure enough, Saul and all of his sons die in battle. Including Jonathan, which is really sad. Like I mentioned, Jonathan was a great guy. And during these chapters, we got to see the bond between David and Jonathan. And what's really sad about David and Jonathan's bond is that they seem a little bit naive, right? But like in an innocent way, right? Where Jonathan very quickly perceived that David was going to be the future king. And if Jonathan had been any other person, he would have been bitterly jealous. Because Jonathan's supposed to be the king, right? And so he realizes that David's going to be his replacement. But Jonathan isn't jealous. Instead, Jonathan supports it. And they seem to have this like kind of naive hope that one day it will all work out where David is king and Jonathan can be his right-hand man. Because they're best friends. But as time passes, they begin to realize that that's not going to happen. Right? And Jonathan begins to realize that there's no way that David can become king while he's still alive. And so before they depart from one another for the final time, David and Jonathan make a covenant with one another. And they say, hey, however this turns out, if one of us dies, the other person is going to take care of their family. And so David and Jonathan make this covenant. It's very sweet. Whenever you think of like friendships in the Bible, David and Jonathan are like top tier. Like they're the friendship we should all hope to have.
Yes.
But Saul, Jonathan, all of Saul's sons, they all die in this battle. Which means that leading into 2 Samuel, there's now a vacant spot for the throne. This slide right here, just to summarize it very quickly, these are the two instances where David did have an opportunity to kill King Saul. And the main thing I wanted to highlight is that in both instances, it was his concern with Saul being the Mashiach of God that held his hand back. Right? He said, I will not raise my hand against the Lord's anointed. But eventually, Saul does die, and all of Saul's sons die, which means that when you get to 2 Samuel chapters 1 through 10, David becomes the king. Dun, dun, dun. This guy comes up to David, and he announces to David how exactly everything went. He says, hey, I am an Amalekite, and I was at the battle where Saul fought the Philistines, and I came across Saul, and Saul had fallen on his own sword, but he was not dead, and so he asked me to kill him, to take him out of his misery. And so the guy says, I killed him, and I brought the crown back to you, my king. And normally you would think that someone would be happy about this, right? I mean, Saul has been chasing David for 10 years, making David's life miserable. Anybody else would be, like, ecstatic. My enemy is dead. But notice how David responds. David says, how is it that you were not afraid to send forth your hand to destroy the Mashiach of Yahweh? And so he calls forth one of his young men and says, approach and fall upon this man. So he struck him and he died. And David said, your blood is on your head, for your mouth is answered against you. I have put the Mashiach of Yahweh to death.
Very technical here.
So this guy comes up to David and says, hey, I killed your enemy. And most likely this guy is coming to David announcing this because he's hoping for some rewards. Right? He's like, yeah, hey, David, Saul's been really making your life hell for the last 10 years. I took him out. He's wanting to gain some like promotions or something out of this. And David says, how dare you touch the anointed of God? And he has the guy put to death. And then, whenever you go into the rest of 2 Samuel chapter 1, David begins to sing a song. And he begins to praise Saul. And he starts talking about how amazing Saul was. And he says, Saul, you were the best king ever. And you're reading it and you're like, did David see something we didn't see? Which once again lets you know that David is built different. Right? Apparently, a man after God's own heart loves his enemies. Because whenever you read David's song in 2 Samuel chapter 1, you get a way better impression of Saul than all of 1 Samuel gave you.
Wow.
When you read 1 Samuel, you see, oh, Saul's a tyrant. When David sings about Saul, though, he says, Saul, you're amazing. I love you. And it's like, whoa, David, this dude tried to kill you for 10 years. But he says, that's all right.
Yeah.
He's an amazing king. Like, David, he's forgiving, right? It's like everything David does, you're like, wow, this guy is spectacular. And to be clear, there have been a few things already that I haven't mentioned that have shown that David isn't perfect. And we're going to very quickly get to some stuff that shows that he definitely is not perfect. But the main thing that I do want to highlight throughout all of this is that he is a man after God's own heart. And he is very different than everybody else. Right? And so, whenever you get to 2 Samuel, this is kind of how the book is structured. Right? In chapters 2 through 4, we get to see David promoted to being king over Judah. Right? Because it seems like this kind of split has developed in the land. Where Judah is the tribe that David is from, and so they're going to ally themselves with him. And he's going to be king over Judah for 7 years. And then eventually, he's going to be the king over all of Israel for 33 years after that. So all in all, 40 years. Right? Chapters 2 through 4 are him as king over Judah. Chapters 5 through 24 are him as king over everyone else. And the way it goes down is this. He's anointed as king in chapter 2. Right? However, there's an issue to this. Because it turns out that Saul did have a bastard son named Ishbosheth. And he's the only remaining heir of King Saul. And so, Saul's commander-in-chief named Abner goes and gets Ishbosheth and puts him on the throne. Right? And so, he becomes the king over Israel. Right? And so, there's kind of this conflict between them. Right? So, David is king over Judah. Ishbosheth is king over Israel. But once again, David trusts God. He has no desire to take Ishbosheth out. He has no desire to force himself over the throne. So he is just being patient and allowing God to do his thing. And so Abner and Ishbosheth are in the north, and very quickly it becomes evident that Ishbosheth is not a good king, right? He does not have what it takes to be king, and so Abner, he defects to David's side. And you realize that Abner's kind of the one who calls the shots, right? Abner's been with Saul throughout all of Saul's reign, and now he was the one who put Ishbosheth on the throne. And now Abner defects over to David and says, hey, David, buddy, I want to be on your side now. And David says, absolutely, I would love to have you on my side. Welcome back, right? David, he's just a very forgiving guy, right? He's like, bygones be bygones. Yes, you supported the guy who was trying to kill me for 10 years, and you tried to kill me several times too. It's all right. These things happen, right? So David forgives Abner. However, there is one man who does not forgive Abner, and that is David's nephew and his military commander named Joab. Right? So Joab is to David what Abner was to King Saul. And one thing you need to know is that during this time period when Ishbosheth was on the throne, Abner and Joab got into a bit of a kerfluffle. Right? They got into a fight between the soldiers of Judah and the soldiers of Israel. And during this battle, Abner ended up accidentally killing Joab's brother. And there's a principle that we have when it comes to Joab. What's our principle?
You don't mess with Joab.
You don't mess with Joab. Right? You mess with Joab, he will remember that. Right? And what you need to know about Joab is that he is somebody who is fiercely loyal to David to such a degree that eventually when David gets a little bit older, he's going to think that, you know what? Like, he knows David better than David knows himself, and he can rule even better than David. By the end of 2 Samuel, Joab, I would argue, is the primary antagonist.
Okay.
But we begin to see that right off the bat here. Because Abner defects to David's side. And David accepts this. But then Joab says, hey, Abner, it's so good to see you, man. I'm so glad you're on our side. Here, come over to this dark alleyway with me real quick. I want to talk some battle strategy with you. And so Abner walks over there with Joab, and Joab stab, kills Abner.
Whoa.
Well, Abner could have been really useful to them. But Joab held a grudge. All right? Well, now Abner's out of the way, but Ishbosheth is still king. But it turns out that everybody else realizes that Ishbosheth is not a good king either, and so his own people turn against him, and they kill him as well. And so in chapter 4, Ishbosheth is also dead. which now means that all of Saul's heirs are officially dead, and now Israel also needs a king in addition to Judah. So who do they go to? David.
Okay.
Right? And so now David is going to be the anointed, the new king over all the land, and for 33 years he is going to reign as king. When you get to chapter 5, David has his first order of business. And his first order of business is to get a new capital. Right? He says, okay, I want to unify this people. Right? And if you go into the territory of Benjamin, which is on the border of Israel and Judah, right? In the territory of Benjamin, there was a city called Jebus. Right? It was inhabited by a Canaanite group known as the Jebusites. Right? Well, David, he sees that city and he says, dang, that is a nice city. It'd be a shame if somebody conquered that. And he does that. He conquers the city of Jebus and he renames it Jerusalem. And he makes Jerusalem the capital city in an attempt to unify the nation. Right? So now, because if you go to, like, the capital he was reigning from before was a city called Hebron, and that was in the center of Judah. Well, if you're way down there, you're not going to unify the people. Right? So he gets a city that's on the border of both of them. Right? It's the perfect place. And from this chapter going forward, Jerusalem is the most important city on the face of the planet, even to this day. Right? I think that's kind of cool. Right? So David picks Jerusalem, and therefore God is going to pick Jerusalem as well. However, when you get to chapter 6, we get to see another thing that makes David a man after God's own heart. Because he says, okay, I may be the king that Israel sees, but Yahweh is the king that Israel serves. During the reign of King Saul, we never heard about the Ark of the Covenant. Because once again, Saul did not care about God. Right? So the last time we heard about the Ark of the Covenant was after the Philistines ended up putting it on the donkey and they brought it back. Right? During Saul's reign, you never hear about it. Now that David is king, he says, I have made my capital in Jerusalem, and now we need to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. Because our nation will be one nation under God. If I, the king over Israel, am living in Jerusalem, then God, the true king over Israel, needs to be living right next to me. Right? The religious capital and the political capital need to be the same thing. And so chapter 6, probably one of my favorite chapters in the entire Bible.
Wow.
It's a great story. David gets the Ark of the Covenant and brings it in. And it is a full-out celebration. Right? David is like half naked, dancing through the streets, throwing a party. He is excited. He is jubilant. Just imagine the message that gives off. Right? The leader of a nation leading a religious ceremony, praising God, beating in sweat, having tambourines, and just like celebrating. It's an amazing moment, right? And this does not, whenever you think of kings, usually what are kings wearing?
Crowns and robes, and occasionally they have a little staff with a board.
Yeah, and whenever they go out in public, what are kings usually doing?
They're sitting on like a throne thing. They're being carried by a throne.
Yeah, they're usually like being carried by somebody or sitting on a throne, or if they're walking, they're just all dignified and just like waving their hands and smiling. That's not David, right? David could care less about looking like a king. David cares about one thing, and that's serving God. And so he's dancing through the streets, he's making a total fool of himself, and his wife sees this. And his wife, whenever he gets home, he's having, like, it's one of those days, I feel so bad for David. You know those days whenever you're just having, like, a great day, and everything's going perfectly, and then you just get home, and, like, just one of your family members just makes one little comment that just ruins your day?
Right, I know how that feels.
That's the day that David has. Because he's having the best day of his life. He comes home, and he's like, God bless you, my friend. God bless you. God bless you. Dinner's on me. Drink's on me. He's having a great time. He comes home, and Saul's daughter, Michal, one of David's wives, he has multiple wives at this point. One of his wives, Michal, says, oh, how the king of Israel presented himself today. She says, David, my dad would have never acted like this. Right? Because keep in mind, Michal was a princess. Right? She grew up in a palace. She knows what it's like to be royalty, to be dignified. She says, David, my dad would have never done stuff like this. You made a fool of yourself today. And he says, honey, I'm going to make myself more undignified than this. He says, I don't know if you remember this, but God picked me over your dad. Yeah, so your dad might have acted differently. That's okay. I'm here to serve God, and I will serve God. And then like mic drop, walks out.
All right.
Right? It's an amazing story. Which then leads to chapter 7. In chapter 7 you have... So if chapter 6 is one of my favorite chapters in the Bible, chapter 7 is probably one of the most significant chapters in the Bible. Right? David is looking out over all that God has given him. And he says, you know what? God has given me so much. He took me from the shepherd's fields. And he's given me a kingdom. And not only has he given me a kingdom, he has given me a palace of wood and cedar. And I am now like the king over all of God's people, reigning in God's holy city. I am neighbors with God himself. The Ark of the Covenant is right there. And he says, but here I am living in a house of cedar and God's dwelling in a tent. He says, I want to build a temple for God. I want to build a house for him like he's built a house for me. But through the prophet Nathan, God says, no. That's not how things are going to be. He says, don't worry, your son will build a house for me. But I'm not done building a house for you quite yet. And what God does is he makes a covenant with David. And in this covenant, God says that he is going to make a great name for David. He's going to appoint a place for Israel, and he's going to plant Israel in that place. He's going to give David rest from his enemies. He's going to make a house for David. He is going to make David's seed build Yahweh's house and rule on the throne in Jerusalem forever. He's going to be a father to David's seed forever, and he is going to make David's kingdom and throne last forever. It is an eternal, unconditional covenant that the Mashiach going forward will always come from David's household. And not only will he come from David's household, but he will be rightfully called the Son of God. Because God will be like a father to him. Right? And so he says, David, because you have loved me so much, and because you've been so devoted to me, I will exalt you. And I will exalt your household. And this chapter right here changes everything in the rest of the Bible. Right? The reason we are called Christians today is because we have placed our faith in the seed of David.
Wow.
Right? So this chapter changes absolutely everything. And when you get to chapters 8, 9, and 10 of 2 Samuel, we just get to see David once again being absolutely amazing. Right? Like this guy is spectacular. Right? Here he is at the height of his kingdom. Like chapters 8, 9, and 10, or chapters 6 through 10 probably, are really just like the best chapters of David's reign. I would argue they're the high point of all Israel. Right? Maybe not from a worldly prosperity perspective, but from like a spiritual devotion perspective. Because here David is, and God's given him everything. And when you get to chapters 8, 9, and 10, David says, now that I've received everything, what can I give to somebody else? Right? Like, that's crazy. Right? What a mentality. We're usually so focused on being like, ooh, what else can I need for myself? But David's like, I just want to give to people. And so we get to see David, like God, just wanting to give and give and give. Until you get to chapter 11. When all of a sudden, David, the man after God's own heart, decides he wants to take something. Chapters 11 and 12 set in motion the rest of David's story. And it's going to make the rest of David's life story basically a living hell. And so this is how it goes. Basically what happens is that 1 year, whenever the kings would go out to war, usually there was a set time to go out to war and everything, David decides to stay home. We're not told why he stays home, but you can probably reason through it, right? He's lived a tough life, right? He's spent years on the run. He's spent years on the battlefield, and he's a king now, right? I mean, it doesn't take much for us to think, oh, I've earned some time to treat myself, right? I mean, this is our mentality, right? Yeah. David, if anybody deserved some downtime, it's David. He probably got in that mentality. He decided to stay home. And so while everybody's off at war, he just goes for a evening stroll out on his balcony, and he looks down, and he sees this woman bathing. And this woman is very, very beautiful. And he looks, and he calls over one of his servants and says, who is that? And the servant says, that is Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. And if you know who Uriah is, Uriah was one of those mighty men of David. right? Whenever David was on the run from Saul and all the lowly outcasts came to David and he turned them into an army, Uriah was one of them. So Uriah is one of those people who was there for David when David needed him most. And the guy says, well, that's the wife of Uriah the Hittite. And David says, call her over. Bathsheba comes over and David sleeps with her. Okay. A few weeks later, David receives a letter from Bathsheba. It says 2 words. I'm pregnant. Now David's got an issue on his hands because David's like, well, crud. Like, this is like, whenever you read this, you're like, David, what happened? Right? But if you've been careful with your Bible reading, you'll notice that David's weakness was always women. Right? Throughout the story, even like whenever he's on the run and everything, you start seeing these multiplying wives. And so David was faithful in so many ways, but women are his weakness. And so now he's got to figure out a way to conceal his sin. Right? Because, and David, he's not used to this, right? He's used to being a righteous guy, but he doesn't want to lose that reputation. He's starting to think like King Saul a little bit.
Yeah. And
so what he does is he calls for Uriah to come back from the battle. And Uriah comes back and they get together and he says, Uriah, my friend, it's so good to see you. Tell me, how's the battle going? And Uriah says, oh, it's going pretty good. And, Uriah gives him some updates. And David says, you know what? I'm so glad you're here. How about this? Go home, wash your feet, and enjoy some time with your wife tonight. What David's trying to do is he's trying to get Uriah to sleep with Bathsheba so that whenever Bathsheba starts showing her pregnancy, everybody they think that it's Uriah's. They didn't have paternity tests back then, right? And so he wants to convince Uriah that this child is his. However, the next morning he finds Uriah sleeping with the slaves and the servants. And he says, Uriah, what are you doing here? And Uriah says, my king, I appreciate you trying to send me home, but how could I go and enjoy my wife when my brothers are out there dying in battle? Turns out that Uriah is a lot more like David at his best.
Oh, wow.
Right? It turns out that Uriah, he learned a lot from David, and apparently Uriah is a pretty faithful guy. This is how David used to speak, right? And Uriah says, I can't go do that.
This is familiar.
And David says, oh, crud. And at this point, like, every moment is an opportunity for him to repent. Right? David should say, Uriah, I gotta be honest with you, man. I messed up. I'm sorry. But he doesn't do that. He says, okay, Uriah, come to my house tonight. We're gonna have a banquet. And this time he gets Uriah drunk. He's trying to lower his inhibitions. At the end of the night, Uriah, go back home. Enjoy your wife. Yet Uriah does the same exact thing. He still won't go do it. Even when he's drunk. So even Uriah, in a drunken stupor, is better than David right now. That's crazy. And at this point, David should repent, right? I mean, it's like, think about it, right? David is willing to sleep with Uriah's wife, but Uriah isn't willing to sleep with his own wife, right? That's bad. And so
I always wonder what the motivation for the whole Bathsheba and David story was.
Lust.
Yeah, I know, but it seemed kind of unclear. It felt always to me that it was just abrupt. How it just all.
Well, that's because the Bible doesn't tell us here. I imagine that there were other smaller issues that David... I mean, that's what I'm saying. Like, we saw earlier on in the text that David was multiplying wives. Yeah. Right? So it's not like they showed up out of nowhere, but the Bible doesn't tell us every detail about David's life. Yeah. I mean, so, Uriah still won't sleep with her. And so finally David does the unspeakable. He writes a letter to Joab. Right? Because remember, Joab, he's ruthless. And he says, hey, Joab, I want you to put Uriah in the front lines of the battle. And when the battle's at its fiercest, I want you to pull everybody back so that Uriah dies. And he rolls up the letter, he seals it, and he gives it to Uriah to deliver. So Uriah has to deliver his own death note. Joab receives the letter, he opens it up, he reads it, and Joab's fine with stuff like this, right? Joab's like, oh, it's about time. He's probably cheering because he's like, yes, I've corrupted David. And so they end up losing the battle, and Joab writes a letter to David and says, hey, well, we lost a lot of men, but your servant Uriah the Hittite also died. And then David, he says, these things happen. It's okay. You win some, you lose some. So not only did Uriah die, but a bunch of innocent people also died. all because of David's folly. But now, David has a great opportunity. Because now, David, he can marry Bathsheba and make himself look really good. Because now, he's no longer the husband, or he's no longer the king who took one of his friend's wives. Now what he is he is the benevolent and compassionate king who took in his friend's widow to comfort her in the loss of her husband. Right now, he looks good. Right now, he can take Bathsheba in, and if Bathsheba gets pregnant, it simply looks like the king was comforting her in the loss of her husband. It makes him look great. And so David thinks he gets away with this sin. Until you get to chapter 12. The prophet Nathan shows up one day. And the prophet Nathan, he comes knocking at David's door and says, "Hey, David, I've got a situation I wanted to ask you about." And David says, "Okay, let me hear it." And Nathan says, "All right, well, there's a situation I came across that I just need your advice on." He says, there are these two guys, right? A rich guy and a poor guy. The rich man has so much stuff. He's got all the animals, all the possessions, everything you could ever ask for, 1,000,000 sheep, everything. The poor guy, the only thing he has to his name is just one little tiny ewe lamb, right? She doesn't have he doesn't have anything, right? He treats this lamb like a daughter, right? He takes it out for walks. He feeds it. He shares the dinner table with it. Whenever it comes time to go to bed at night, he cuddles with the lamb and just to keep it warm. This lamb is this poor guy's whole life. Well, a traveler came to the rich man's house one day, and the rich man wanted to feed the traveler. And so what he did is he took the poor man's lamb, sacrificed it, and fed it to the traveler. And he says, "David, maybe you're seeing something I don't, but that seems wrong to me, doesn't it? Doesn't that just seem messed up? I mean, this guy had everything, yet he took this other guy's everything." And David says, "This is unspeakable. That such a thing could happen in Israel is ridiculous. This man must pay fourfold for what he has done. Who is this man?" And Nathan says, "You are. You're the man, David. Think about all God had given you. He took you from the shepherd's fields and he gave you a palace. He gave you a kingdom. Think about all the wives he'd given you. And if you'd asked for more, he would have given those too. But instead, you took the wife of Uriah the Hittite. You took his wife and you took his life. And therefore, this child that you're having with Bathsheba, he's going to die as punishment for your sin." And this is where we get to see David, the man after God's own heart, come out again. Because he makes no excuses. He hears what Nathan says, and he says, "I have sinned against Yahweh." And over the course of the next several weeks, David falls on his face, fasts, and he weeps, and he prays. Once again, he does what Eli did not do, right? And he cries out and says, "God, please have mercy on my son." But that doesn't happen, right? The child is born, but the child does eventually die. And the people don't want to announce the news to David because they're like, "Oh," I mean, David's already been like killing himself a little bit while the child was sick. What's he going to do once he hears the child has died? Like, they're afraid David's going to commit suicide.
Right.
And David overhears them talking, and he says, "Is the child dead?" And they say, "Yes." And he gets up, he takes a shower, he eats food, and he goes and starts worshiping God. And they're like, "Oh, okay, the king's gone crazy." And he says, "Guys, no, let me explain." He says, "While the child was yet living, I prayed and asked God, hoping that maybe he would be merciful. But now the child is dead. God has made his decision. Now I must make mine. And I trust that God is good, and so I will worship God. My child is not coming back to me. I will return to him one day, though." So he says, God's made his decision. That's why I'm worshiping. And so this chapter is really messed up, right? Because here you see David, even the best of men are men at best, right? And he screws up royally here. And it's going to affect the rest of his life. But the chapter ends with a positive twist. And David ends up fixing things with God. And going into the rest of 2 Samuel, David and God's relationship is going really well. However, there are consequences for your actions. And so, whenever you get into 2 Samuel chapters 13 through 24, the rest of David's life is just miserable. It's one bad thing after another. And 2 Samuel 13 through 24 is the Christian Game of Thrones. And what I'll do is I'm just going to summarize this rapid fire for you, just so you can hear about what all happens here. So I mentioned how David had a bunch of wives, and as a result, he has a bunch of kids too, right? Well, it turns out that he has this one daughter named Tamar, who is very attractive. And he has this son named Amnon, who is very attracted to Tamar, his half-sister. Amnon ends up raping Tamar, right? Well, Tamar's full brother, Absalom, hears about this and is very upset about this. And so he sets in motion a plan wherein he kills Amnon, right? And so now, I mean, this whole situation is really bad, right? So Amnon has raped Tamar, Absalom has killed Amnon, and now Absalom goes on the run because obviously dad's not going to be happy that one son just killed another son. It's like Cain and Abel all over again. Yeah. So Absalom goes on the run, and David and Absalom are not on speaking terms, right? So Absalom and David, they're far apart for a while. But then eventually Joab comes before David and says, hey, David, buddy, this is not a good look for you, right? It is not good because people love Absalom. And it's not a good look for the king and his son to not be on speaking terms. I know what Absalom did was really bad, but y'all have got to mend things. Yeah. And so David says, okay, fine. And so he invites Absalom to come move back to Jerusalem. But he still doesn't speak to him. And he still doesn't invite him to stay in the same house. He says, you can stay in Jerusalem, but you're not my son, basically. Well, Absalom gets upset about this. And he's like, what the heck? I thought, like, he gets mad at Joab. Because he's like, hey, Joab, you told me that, like, if I move back to Jerusalem, things between me and my dad would be okay. And so he sends a message to Joab, but basically Joab leaves him on red. Right? Like, with modern, vernacular. Right? Joab doesn't respond to Absalom's message. And Absalom's upset because he's like, you told me that this is what was going to happen, but it didn't happen. What's the deal? And so Joab does not respond to Absalom. Absalom gets really mad about this, and he goes and burns down Joab's field. Well, what's our principle with Joab? You don't mess with Joab. And so going forward, Joab is no longer on Absalom's side. Just keep that in mind. Eventually, though, Absalom and David kind of start mending things, but once again, it's too little too late. Absalom decides to throw a coup. Right? He ends up getting together a bunch of people. They go down to Hebron, and they announce that he is the new king of Israel. And they present it like this is an official thing. And by the time David hears news of it, everybody's already supporting it. And David could fight back against Absalom here, but he doesn't want to. Right? So what David does, first off, he doesn't want to fight his son. And second off, he doesn't want to lead the nation into civil war. And so, placing his trust in God, David gets up and he exiles himself. Right? He goes down through the Mount of Olives. He escapes into the wilderness once again. And now King David is also on the run like he was so long before. And now Absalom is the new King Saul. It's a really sad story. But what David does do is he plants some spies inside the palace to ultimately lead to Absalom's ruin from within. There's Hushai is the spy that David places there. And then Ahithophel is basically like this prototype Judas figure that we meet in the story. Hushai, the spy that David places there, he basically buys David some time so that David can figure out exactly what to do. But eventually, Absalom and his men all go down there. They cross the Jordan so they can fight against David. And David wants to go down into battle, but his soldiers say, no, you can't do this. Because David, you have to realize your life is more valuable than all of our lives. Because if you die, the kingdom is lost. Right? If we die, we're just soldiers on the battlefield. But you are the Lord's Mashiach. Right? You're the Lord's anointed one. You cannot die. And so they say, you need to stay back. We'll go fight the battle for you. And David makes one request of them. Do you know what the request is?
I don't.
To bring his son back to him?
Yeah. Well, yeah. He says, don't kill Joab.
Okay.
I mean, don't kill Absalom. Mm-hmm. Right? He says, don't kill my son. Once again, you kind of see that naive hope with David where it's like, he's just hoping that maybe he and Absalom can patch things up. He should have been mature and patched things up sooner. But he wants to fix things, right? He doesn't want his son to be killed. Well, they go off into battle. And Absalom loses very quickly. right? Turns out that David knows how to throw together an army, and Joab, they win easily. And Absalom starts running, and one thing you need to know about Absalom is that he had a wild mane of hair, right? So like Saul was a head taller than everybody else. Well, Absalom, he was also known because of his head. He had so much hair that every year when he got it cut, there were 5 pounds of hair cut, right? Dude had a lot of hair. Well, he is fleeing, and while he is fleeing on a donkey, he's going through some branches, and his hair gets caught up in the branches, and he's left dangling from a tree. Well, guess who happens to come by him? Joab. Joab finds Absalom dangling there, and David did say, "Don't kill Absalom," but Absalom burned down Joab's field, and you don't mess with Joab. And so Joab stabs Absalom, and then he commands a bunch of other people to do the same thing, so that, whenever David asks who killed Absalom, who can say? Everybody was stabbing him, right? And so Joab and them report back to David, and they say, "Hey, Absalom is dead," and David is grieved by this. Then he starts going around saying, "Absalom, Absalom, my son, Absalom, Absalom," and he's wrecked. And eventually Joab, this kind of seems to be a turning point for Joab too, where he's really kind of had enough with David.
Yeah.
And I kind of understand where he's coming from a little bit. But he says, "David, you're a king. These people just put their lives on the line protecting you, and you're responding with grief. I know that you lost a son, but you won a kingdom. And by grieving right now, you are making these people feel like they did a terrible thing when they were serving you." So he says, now it's not time to be a father. Now is the time to be a king. And David, to be fair, David does take that rebuke and he rolls with it. And he does go thank the people for winning the battle. And so as David is returning into the city, or returning into the land, there's another rebellion that gets kicked off, mainly by this guy named Sheba. Sheba leads this rebellion where he's basically wanting to, so what happens is that whenever David's crossing back the Jordan River, the people of Judah come to welcome David across, and the rest of the people of Israel feel slighted by this because they feel like David was showing favoritism to Judah by having them welcome him. It's just politics, stuff like that. Well, the people of Israel are like, "Oh, well, if David doesn't like us, then we don't like him," even though David never said that he didn't like them, right? They're just making this stuff up. And Sheba decides to lead this rebellion, but it ends up really going nowhere. Really, the person behind the scenes in all of this is Joab, who is really becoming a bigger thorn in David's side. And so, that gets you through chapter 20. In the final 4 chapters of 2 Samuel are just kind of epilogues, right? They're just closing up different stories in David's life to just kind of bring things to a conclusion. One thing worth highlighting here is David's last words, right? And it's not like the last words before he died, because that's going to be in 1 Kings. But it's his last public proclamation, and it's a song. He says this: "David the son of Jesse declares, the man who was raised on high declares, the Mashiach of the God of Jacob, and the sweet psalmist of Israel. The Spirit of Yahweh spoke by me, and his word was on my tongue. The God of Israel said, the Rock of Israel spoke to me. He who rules over men as a righteous one, who rules in the fear of God, is as the light of the morning when the sun rises, a morning without clouds, from brightness of the sun after rain, with the tender grass springing from the earth. Truly is not my house so with God, for he has made an everlasting covenant with me, ordered in all things and secured. For all my salvation and all my desire will he not indeed make it grow. But the vile men, every one of them, will be thrust away like thorns, because they cannot be taken in hand. But the man who touches them must be armed with iron and the shaft of a spear, and they will be completely burned with fire where they sit." So David's final proclamation is that if a king wants to be faithful to God, he has to put God above everything else. And if he wants to be a faithful king to the people, it all hinges around your faithfulness to God. That's his proclamation. And like I said, the other chapters there in 2 Samuel are just kind of little closing vignettes. We get to see David's final battle. And what I love about it is that David is fighting against a giant, and the giant overpowers him. But just before the giant kills him, one of David's mighty men steps in and blocks the blow. And it's just really cool because then you get to read that a bunch of other giants were killed during David's time. And so if you're comparing the beginning of David's story to the end, David started off as David the giant killer. He was willing to step up and fight a giant when nobody else would. But the legacy David leaves behind is he created a kingdom of giant killers, right? To where even whenever he can no longer fight, there are a dozen other men who are willing to stand in his place, right? And so it's just it's a really touching story, and then you get to read about David's mighty men and all their exploits and stuff like that. And then the most important thing, the way that 2 Samuel ends, the final chapter, is with David purchasing a threshing floor. And this is the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. And there's this whole story as to why he purchased it. But the main reason why this story ends there is because ultimately this threshing floor is going to be cleared out, and it's going to be the place where the temple is built. Right? And so 2 Samuel begins with Hannah. 1 Samuel begins with Hannah coming to the tabernacle and praying for a son. Right? And that son leads revival that communicates that God is going to dwell with the people. And then 2 Samuel ends with the foundation being laid for God to actually have a physical temple, which will be constructed by Solomon. And so there is the rise of the monarchy of Israel with Samuel, Saul, and David. Rapid fire. Do y'all have anything y'all want to add to wrap that whole thing up?
I'd say it was a good summary.
Yeah, I wish we could go a lot more in depth, but we had to go through 2 Samuel super quickly because I spent way too much time in 1 Samuel.
Yeah, that's
but
okay.
yeah.